Western Kentucky University is in the city of Bowling Green, Kentucky. It's a beautiful campus laid out on rolling hills, and I loved wandering the campus, checking out different buildings, and getting involved in student activities while I was a student there. When I was at WKU, I landed a job as an AV specialist, which was mainly setting up projectors and audio equipment for various presentations and events around campus. For one job, I had to go to Van Meter Hall, which is one of the oldest buildings on campus. And it's a very ornate building right at the tip of the campus. I had to park near the building and make my way into the tunnels underneath the stairs at the main entrance. As I was carrying some cables through the tunnel, I felt a sudden wave of cold envelop my body. The temperature felt like it dropped 30 degrees in just a few seconds. And needless to say, this was a literal chill down my spine. It shook me a bit, and I stood there motionless for a few moments, trying to figure out the source of this wave of cold. As I stood there, I began to hear whispering of some strange voice I couldn't understand, and this froze my mind with fear. I was about ready to spin and run away when suddenly the temperature went back to normal and the voices stopped. This was one of the weirdest things that had ever happened to me, and eventually I decided I needed a paycheck, and I proceeded into the auditorium to finish the job. I had just set up a speaker and a microphone and run the cables so that people could hear a presentation coming up later in the day. And I was almost done when suddenly I felt the same blast of cold hit me, and this time it felt like it came from above. Then I heard a yell, "Ah!" and a terrible thud on the stage. I scanned the area, and I saw nothing. But then, the whispering began again. It seemed to be getting closer to me, and it was filling the room, coming from everywhere. And for the second time, I was locked in place. And for a few seconds, I stood there, listening to these strange voices and feeling that cold encase my body. I bolted for the door and ran through the auditorium and back into the tunnels underneath the building. I burst out the main door into the light, and I could feel the cold lift from me. I glanced back at the building as I walked away, and I could swear I could see a strange shape looking back at me. I couldn't tell if it was beckoning me for help or if it wanted me to join it. I didn't care to explore either one of those options, so I leapt in my car and drove away. Luckily, I'd finished my job in the auditorium, so I didn't get in any trouble. When they asked me to go back and tear down the setup the next day, I made an excuse about having a cold and told them to see if they could get somebody else to do that job. Later, I would hear a story about Van Meter Hall and the auditorium, and apparently a student had been setting up lights for a production, and they fell off a ladder. Reports said they broke their neck when they hit the stage. Other people would report hearing the voices and seeing strange shapes inside Van Meter. Luckily for the rest of my time at Western Kentucky University, I didn't have to go back there. I had a great time at college, except for one very unnerving incident that almost caused me to drop out of school entirely. I was attending classes at Western Kentucky University, and everything was cruising along fine. I had a group of friends that I hung out with. and was in a major I really liked, and I was generally doing well in school. Unfortunately, I'd been assigned to live in Rodes-harlin Hall, which was built with a bunch of other dorms in a quad-like area on campus. It was a nondescript red brick building which was 9 stories tall. At first, it was a great place to live. We hung out, we studied, went to parties, and in general, I had no complaints until one day. I was coming across the quad, heading to the dorm, when I heard a scream from up high, and it descended to the ground, and I heard a sickening thud on the concrete. This series of sound locked me in place as fear gripped my entire body. Then I spun around to see if I could see a body or anybody else that saw this. But unfortunately, it was summer on campus and there was virtually nobody around. After several long seconds, I freed myself from this icy grip of fear and slowly moved toward the dormitory. I gave one quick look around the grounds and saw nothing out of place. I went inside the lobby, and as I entered, I felt a sense of utter desperation and sadness overtake me. It was like this feeling that held me down. And it was as if somebody else's emotions were seeping into my mind, dragging me down into this dark hole that I felt I couldn't escape. I made my way through the lobby, but all the time I was feeling this dark presence. It was really weighing me down. I was living on the 6th floor and I pressed the elevator button. I could hear the elevator starting its way down. And then I heard crying behind me. I spun around and I could hear the crying echoing off the walls. I could swear there was a strange shape making its way toward me. Panic filled me and I didn't even think about the stairs for a few seconds. I kept slamming the elevator button, praying for it to come faster. And the shape just got closer and closer. Finally, I realized there was no way I could wait for that elevator. I bolted for the door to the stairs and sprinted up 6 full flights of stairs to my room. I ran into the room and slammed the door shut. I was breathing as hard as I ever had, and I thought my heart was going to burst from the exertion, but also from the fear. I stood with my back to the door, panting, and I eventually calmed myself down. I went to my bed and just dropped on it. I laid there praying that nothing would knock on that door because I didn't have the power to stop anything that came through it. Somehow, I either passed out or just fell asleep, and I woke up hours later disoriented, recalling vague fragments of the encounter or whatever it was. At first, I just thought it might have been a dream. But then I felt the sense of dread, knowing that I had to go back to class, and I was going to have to go back down to that lobby. I killed time waiting hours, even missing a class, but eventually I had no choice. I took the elevator down. I was ready to bolt as soon as the door opened, and it reached the 1st floor. The door slid open, and I slowly pushed my head outside, and then I just saw a normal lobby. I held my ground for a few seconds, and then I walked as fast as I could to get through the lobby and out into the light of day. I walked away from the building, and I could see a shape at the top of the building, looming there, watching me, and it stepped off the edge of the building, and I heard that scream. I didn't wait. I just turned and ran. I didn't want to hear the sound of that impact again. I ended up getting transferred out of that dorm as fast as I could. I never spent another night there. I ended up couch surfing with friends until I could find a new place. For the rest of my time at WKU, I avoided that area of campus. Ouija boards are really strange things. Most people view them as toys or like some board game for people who are gullible or sucked into tales of the macabre. I viewed them that way till I had to do a story about ghosts on campus when I was a student at Western Kentucky University. It was October and Halloween was coming. I worked for the student newspaper, and with Halloween coming up, they wanted stories about ghosts on campus. There had been a tale moving around campus about girls who'd seen a ghost in McLean Hall. So being the inquisitive one, I decided to check it out. McLean Hall is one of the premier dorms on campus. I went inside and, being the good reporter, asked around and finally was able to find one of the girls who was involved in the possible ghost sighting. I made my way to their dorm room and caught the girl and asked her some questions. I'm going to leave her name out of this because she didn't want it included in the story. But we chatted for a while. She was very quiet and withdrawn, but eventually was able to tell me what happened that fateful night. Earlier in the year, she and her two roommates decided to break out the Ouija board and see if they could talk to any spirits. They turned off the lights, lit some candles, and then went about their spiritual adventure. At first, they were all giggly and laughed. They asked silly questions about if there were any guys on campus who liked them, and sometimes they got answers they wanted to hear, and sometimes they didn't. They were about ready to wrap up the evening when they asked if there were any spirits in their dorm. And suddenly, the Ouija board said yes. And they all exchanged nervous glances at each other like, "Did you do that?" And nobody claimed they had driven the board to say yes. At this point, it was as if the Ouija board controlled them, and they started asking questions about the ghost in the building. They asked if the ghost meant them any harm, and the Ouija board said no. And then things seemed to go a little wonky. They began to ask deeper questions, and some of the answers became ominous. One predicted one of the students would drop out of school, and this upset her greatly. Another one asked about their future, and it said they would do well, but there were no details. And then the final one asked about their future, and the placard just flew off the board and landed on the ground. This frightened the girl so much that she ran from the room. At this point, the girls shut down the session, blew out the candles, and turned on the lights. The girl I interviewed confessed that 2 weeks after the Ouija board session, their roommate had died in a car wreck. I could tell she was shaken up, and so was I a little bit. I decided to conclude the interview, and she offered to walk me out of the dorm. But as we were leaving, I realized I'd left my notebook behind. I told her to stay there, and I ran back to get my notebook. But once I was inside the room, I felt a presence, and I swear I could see a dark shape in the room. For a moment, I desperately wanted to ask a question of the presence, but I was too afraid to know the answer. So I snatched up my notebook and left the room, slamming the door behind me. Sometimes it's best not to know the future.